internet, and welcome to Meet La Prensa. Viewer, if you like what you see here, if you find value here, make sure you like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. So as you can see, in the last day, we've upgraded our audio, we've upgraded our look. One thing we haven't upgraded yet, though, is our broken American immigration system. We have here today a very special guest. We have Eduardo Samaniego, who is a survivor of the American deportation machine. Eduardo, thank you so much for coming on Meet La Prensa.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm really glad to be here. And thank you for opening this space for me to share not only my story, but the story of the hundreds of thousands of people who are currently behind bars and those who have been deported to not only Mexico and South America, but across the world. And it's been in the worst possible way, done in the worst possible way. So I'm here to tell their story too.
Eduardo, our air is your air. Tell us your story.
All right. Well, my story begins in 2016 when I arrived to the United States. I was alone. I was working 40 hours a week, and I was going to school. In school, I was in my last year. I became the student body president, one of the largest high schools in Georgia, and I was all on my own. Later, I learned that through the process, the application process to the universities in the United States, I learned that I was undocumented, and I learned what it meant to be undocumented. And for me at that moment, it meant that I couldn't apply to the University of Georgia like any other of my friends who I was sitting next to, simply because I didn't have a social security number. When I realized this, I remember that my consul told me, the Georgia Board of Regents just passed a new law in the past October, just about 4 months ago. And this law prohibits you from even applying to the University of Georgia, even if you can pay for it. So my story begins there. I started to work later. I graduated from high school. I remember giving my graduation speech to the graduating class, and telling them that it was now time to fly higher than they had ever, imagined, and it was time to really go out there and explore and conquer the world. And as I was telling them those words, I knew that I couldn't go to college, and because I was undocumented and I didn't have that little piece of paper with 9 numbers. Later on, I remember that I met the Dreamers, and that was through Facebook. I met the Dreamers at the Georgia Capitol, and right there and there, I started my fight at the steps of the Georgia Capitol for the Dream Act at that time, and for immigration reform. That's basically, a little bit of my life and how I started my fight for immigrant rights.
So, Eduardo, you find yourself today in Mexico, and this is far from Georgia, obviously. Tell us, how did you end up there?
Sure. It was through a very, very just absolutely devastating, manner and horrible way that I ended up coming back to Mexico, a place that I had left a decade ago, a place where I was escaping from the crime and from the cartels and from all the violence in the streets that I had never seen, and I was able to go to the United States. Unfortunately, I like I said, unfortunately, I met the Dreamers. I met, those organizers, activists, now immigrant rights advocates across the country, from every walk of life, from every state. And I started traveling throughout states. I was participating in civil disobediences. I myself, even not qualifying for DACA and not really being, those who were considered dreamers, because I arrived already when I was 16, and you can't qualify for DACA. I was fighting for DACA so hard that I traveled the entire country, and I got a full ride scholarship to Hampshire College in Massachusetts, $270,000. And it was because of my work as an advocate. It was because of those people that supported me and gave me a chance, and got together and decided that I was someone that was that was someone that they could help to go to college, because so many others are also deserving of that, but I was the lucky one at that point. Unfortunately, one day after living in Massachusetts, I went out to Georgia for a run, and I realized that I forgot my phone and my wallet. And I told the taxi midway, "Hey, can you please go back to my house? Can you please take me to my house? I forgot my wallet and my phone, and I have no way to pay you." So it was just probably less than a half a mile away my house. He refuses to let me come off of the taxi so I could call someone who could come and help me. And he called the police instead. I ended up handcuffed in the back of a police officer's car, and they took me to jail to Upworth, Georgia, the first detention center. And then they took me to the Irwin Detention Center, one of the most infamous detention centers in the world for its history about human rights violations, not only to the women who were recently operated on and had different procedures on them that they were not allowing to buy ice against their wishes, because they were being tortured. And I was transferred to Cobb County Jail. I was transferred to Lovejoy, Georgia Detention Center. And in total, I was in five different detention centers simply because I was undocumented and I couldn't pay $27. And the taxi cop couldn't really didn't want to take me home. I ended up in jail. And in jail, as an advocate for immigrant rights and human rights, for the past 10 years in the United States, I never knew how bad the jail was and how prison was until I experienced it in my skin. I was fighting out there so that immigrants wouldn't end up in jail. I was fighting out there so that they could get freed from jail. And even I, with that work and with that history, I didn't know what was going on in these jails, and how horrifying their treatment, not only of those who are committed for different reasons, but for those who are immigrants and who were detained, unfortunately, just like I was, due to the 287G bill that was passed by Democrats and Republicans around 2007 in the United States, and allowed local and federal police to cooperate to local police to cooperate with immigration and customs enforcement, ICE. And that's the way they were able to detain me, and they were able to deny my freedom for 3 months and a half. I ended up being deported around February of 2009, and I've been here for 2 years. I experienced some of the most horrible things I could share. Someone could share. One of them was looking at how at the Irwin Detention Center, a dad was completely chained by his feet, chained by his hands, and his son, who was probably less than 10 years old, was right behind him. And unfortunately, I was right behind bars, also being rebooked in another prison, and in the Irwin Detention Center prison, and I was witness to the inhumanity of our system. I could not comprehend and really process how a 10 years old child, was being processed at the same detention center where there was real people who were and did incredibly and terrible crimes, and he was going to be there with us. And I watched how the detainees were denied water, how they were denied food, how they were denied access to healthcare, access to mental health, how people would bleed for hours before they would be attended. I remember opening my little package of milk, and the milk was completely rotten. And many of the inmates, they would drink it like that because they were starving and they were hungry. Many others would leave it at the side. But just as that, our food sometimes would come in completely mixed up with everything. They would mix it up and give it to the people, and they would obviously, just enjoy, making them suffer and giving them something that was just absolutely horrifying to eat. Um, we know that prison is not, we should know prison not as a place where people are waiting or being held and will be released, but we need to think about prison, our criminal justice system, and our prisons specifically, as places where torture is ongoing and is something of the everyday. That's what I saw. That's what I experienced. I also unfortunately was placed in solitary confinement by 45 days, just like the former president. It was 45 days in solitary confinement. Um, it was about 9 days. They would put me in solitary confinement in a completely darkened room. They would take me out, and I would continue to protest about the different injustices that were happening to our immigrants in there. And they would put me for another 9 days, 7 days, 5 days, until I counted 45 days completely isolated from all the other inmates, simply because I was raising my voice and I was letting them know that what they were doing went against all humanity that we know.
What detention facility was that where you were detained for 45 days in solitary confinement?
So I was in solitary confinement from Cobb County, Georgia, for about 15 days, and I was in solitary confinement for another 15 days to 25 days. Sometimes it's really hard to actually remember because I was in 5 different prisons, but the other prison was the Irwin Detention Center, where we know that recently, women were being, done procedures that went against their own wishes. So that, prison that has a long record of, violations to human rights and civil rights, just, you know, the rights, constitutional rights, and famous because of that. That's where I was too.
And which detention facility did you see the father that was chained beside his son, his 10-year-old son that you mentioned?
This is at the Irwin Detention Center. The Irwin Detention Center was one of the prisons in Georgia that received many of these young refugee children coming from Central America. And I can tell you, I mean, I was
Walk us
gonna say it
through when
just like
walk us
that.
walk us through when you arrived for the first time at the Irwin Detention Center.
Jesus, I mean, I started looking at I wasn't sure how old many of the girls were, because it was a facility that kept men and women separated, but they kept men and women, and sometimes they would put some people to eat together. And I remember that as I walked in, they gave me all the new clothes to that I would put in, and sometimes they wouldn't give me any underwear or pants, or even a jacket, just like they would give to most of the other inmates. It was something really tormenting, that what they were doing to me. Another thing that I saw in there is that I couldn't tell how old some of the girls were, many, because sometimes I think that they also were refugees coming from Central America, but the only one that I can sure to say that was a small child, less than 10 years old, was that kid in front of me as I was being booked in there. Later on, I saw many women, and probably some of them were their daughters. Probably some of their sons were in there as well, um, but they would be separated. And I can tell you, the food was absolutely horrifying. Every time I would ask for a cup of water, they would not give it to me, and much less when they had me in solitary confinement. They would hand me a cup of ice with ice in it, and I had to keep it in there until the ice melted and I could drink the water. And they were doing it with all the intention of sending a message to me. You're someone that is that we know you've been fighting us. You're someone who has been raising your voice against our criminal justice system, and someone who has been, highly criticizing the work that we do, and we'll make sure that we make your life impossible. And they did. And I remember everything they did. They never gave me my glasses. I was using my glasses as I was, as I was on the taxi, and they took everything from me. And they never put me in front of a doctor, so that many people got their glasses and watched them as they got their glasses when they were booked inside the prison. But they deliberately didn't give them to me. The process of being in jail was something really, really horrendous. I call it nothing less than torture, for my immigrant rights activism and my human rights advocacy.
So you mentioned some very specific tactics that the detention officers in these facilities, tactics that they use to terrorize, to torture detainees. Those detention centers are infamously opaque when it comes to reporting on them. It's really hard to get in there. Even Congress people go to these detention facilities and they get stuck in the lobby. You're someone who's been inside. You're someone who's endured being inside. So I guess I hate to ask it, but I have to. That you're here, but what are some of the worst things you saw? Like, you've mentioned a lot of things here, but talk about a moment where, I guess, what are those times when obviously you have a lot of fight, right? But what were the hardest things that you had to endure? Because honestly, if you don't want to talk about it, that's fine. Obviously, like we want to be completely empathetic to you and recognize your humanity, but at the same time, we want to bury these people in truth, and it's important to know what went on there. So, if you know who did it, if you know why, definitely tell us, because that's what we're here for. That's why we made this show. So.
Absolutely. I'm, thank you for saying that. I appreciate you, and I appreciate the space here, so I can tell the story of really, many stories that I experienced in my skin. I would say one of the many things that I remember is, a young man, who was a Latino, who he had some injury on his leg, and I don't know if he had been hit by one of the police officers, but his feet were bleeding. One of them was bleeding, and one of them, and I also believe that it was broken. And I was right next to the chair where he was sitting, and completely chained, as he kept bleeding. And I kept calling for help for him because he was bleeding a lot, and nobody would come. Nobody would pay attention to him specifically, or to me, because I was screaming at the top of my lungs, this man is bleeding and he's going to bleed out, and he's passing out. He seems that he's about to pass out and completely lose it, but he was still chained in that chair, as if he could, and somehow, be aggressive to anyone in that situation, in that moment that he was. Like I said, for me, it was incredibly sad, when I was denied food for days, when I was in the not sad, but enraging at the same time. And it was sad and raging. It was full of just so many emotions going through my head, as I was being put in solitary confinement, a room that had no lighting, a room that had no water, and a room that had a toilet, but I never would receive paper. And I think that those are very dehumanizing things that happened to me, but that happened also to many, many, many of our, people coming from other countries, and the people there in jail. The retribution of speaking out, of trying to support someone, as I tried to do it many times, to translate their documentation, or to teach them how to give a call, That's why I was being tortured, because I never stopped trying to help these other folks that couldn't even understand a word of the papers that they were receiving, because all of them were in English. And it was retaliation for everything I was trying to do, but it was also um, just another day for them. And I want to say this, Pablo. I think that one of the most horrifying and terrifying things that I have to share is that immigration and customs enforcement is a multiracial, multilingual place where the most forgotten in our communities, Black, Latino, Asian, European immigrants, and I mean European, police officers, and everyone who's in there, I can tell you, it's not just white people, and it's just not white supremacy. We know that white supremacy is what created ICE, and it's what drives it. And they are the principal motor, fueled by hate. Sure. But we also need to know that in there, our brothers and sisters, Latinos, Black, Asian, and so many other, nationalities are
Mhm.
in there as well, cooperating and learning how to torture their own people. It
So
might be because they
you're
need the
talking about the
money.
ICE agents. That the ICE agents that are in there are not just white people. They are also, there is a pan-ethnic coalition of, I mean, let's just call them what they are, Gestapo. So
Right, right. It
walk
is. It is
walk us through
what
the first.
what conforms. Go ahead.
Walk us through the first time you got put in solitary confinement. Like what walk us through a decision that gets made on the inside of the what was the detention center again?
Cobb County Detention Center. That's where I was first put in solitary confinement.
And what, how did that happen? So it sounds to me like you were advocating for your fellow prisoners, advocating for yourself. But what specifically, like, walk us through that day, walk us through that moment when they said you're out of this horrible situation and you're into an even worse situation.
Sure. Well, what happened is that I wouldn't be quiet. That I kept telling the police officers, what you're doing is what Um, it's hard for me to share it, but because it makes me remember those moments, right? That earned me those days in you know that earned me those days in solitary confinement. I was screaming at the top of my lungs. You're putting people in prison who wanna just work hard, who wanna build a life, who have dreams, who have joy, and who wanna have joy of seeing their families and their children. And I kept saying things like that over and over and over again. You are a disgrace. You're someone who is carrying out the worst wishes of the American citizenry, and you should be ashamed of yourself for what you just did by putting that kid in prison, for example. You should be ashamed of not providing this person with a translator so that he can understand when his immigration audience is. And those are the things that earned me those days in solitary confinement. I wouldn't stop telling them how wrong and how dehumanizing it was what they were doing. And I'm not happy, but I earned them with all my struggle in there, and with my banging and my stomping on those walls and those windows. Because if I wasn't um, if I wasn't at peace where I was, just like thousands of others, they as well shouldn't be at peace for what they were doing to us.
Do you remember the names of any of the detention officials who tortured you or tortured other inmates or tortured other detainees rather?
So I remember one of the young people, one of the young guys who would hand me the cups of ice, but they never had their names, and they would always hide their name tags, always, all the cups in there.
Hmm.
So this is a continuous practice that they do so that they don't face retaliation later. But the one who would hand me the cup of ice with ice instead of water, like he would hand, all the other inmates just a cup of water, he was Bishop. And I would always remember his little tag. He was the only one that wore it. uh, Bishop in the Cobb County prison. That was his last name. He was around, I would say, 27 to 33 years old. He was the guy who would hand me the cups of ice instead of handing me water like he would give, most of the other white, especially white inmates.
So we've talked a lot about, and thank you for sharing your story about detention. I know this is difficult, but are you willing to share your story of deportation as well? So you're detained, and then when do you know that they're coming to take you and, I don't know, put you on a plane, put you on a bus? How does it work?
Sure. So it works however they want it to work. Immigration and Customs Enforcement is they have full um, discretion to come and pick you up anytime. Unfortunately, I was in one of the most hateful and county in the country, and famous for its prisons, and as I call it's little Guantanamo system of prisons that they run in Cobb County. That's the county where I was taken. um, it was basically in there where everything began in Cobb County. Now the ex sheriff Neil Warren, who was the one who started working with 287G bill, this 287G bill that allows immigration ICE to work with the local police. He was obviously thrown out in shame these past elections, and he is being sued by the many countless of human rights violations that happened under his watch. And now Cobb County is a county that no longer works with immigration and customs enforcement. They've ended the 287G contract, and Georgia is changing. But I experienced its worst side, just I experienced the best side. Immigration works this way. With me, what they did is they had 72 hours, about 78 hours to come and pick me up. They never came in those 78 hours to pick me up because the 287G bill, they then explained to me, allows them to keep me in there forever. I remember that, I was out of my zone. I was trying to do best to communicate with my people outside. And they wouldn't allow me to give a call outside. They never gave me one call outside except one call that I did to Mexico, to tell my grandparents that I was in jail. Um, they never allowed me to see anyone. They never allowed me to communicate with people outside of prison, as others people did. They would give me a password so that I could go and make my calls on the telephone, and they would say, "You have $20 on your phone, and here it is, your password." And the password would never work because they made sure that they would cut that line every time I try to call someone outside, because they knew that I was going to communicate what I'm communicating right now to you. Um, if you can ask me the last question again, I went a little bit around it.
No, like I said, our airtime is your airtime. This is a story that needs to be told, and it's a story that is infamously difficult to cover from a journalistic perspective. So we are so grateful for every word you're telling us right now. I know I speak for our show. I speak for Ivan too. In the control room, we are hanging on your every word. So the question of detention to deportation. So what is that sort of segment of your life that I'm sure is really difficult to remember, where you knew you were leaving, and how did they
Sure.
transport you from Georgia to Mexico?
Sure. It was also a torturous, experience of knowing when I was going to be deported. I On the 10th day, because of the things that they were doing to me, that I still don't dare to share completely, even though it would be incredibly important and probably empowering for some people to hear them. But I'm still, struggling to share some of the worst things that I experienced, and that the cops in the Cobb County Little Guantanamo prison system did to me. Um, but I know on the 10th day, I told them that I wanted to sign my voluntary departure, my voluntary deportation, right? And voluntary, right? Because at that point, it was not voluntary. I was being tortured, and I could no longer, continue to bear the abuses and the humiliation that I was being subjected to. And so on the 10th day, they take me to a room. They make me sign my voluntary departure, and I say make me sign because I actually decided that I was not going to sign my voluntary departure. I have my left hand is fractured after I jumped out of a second floor on fire that burned 43% of my body, and that I fractured my vertebrae. They knew that my hand was damaged. They took my left hand and they twisted it so badly that something cracked inside of it. As a result of that, now I had to have another surgery on my left hand. And when I couldn't bear the pain on my left hand, I decided that I was going to sign the voluntary departure on the 10th day. Um, wow, it's incredible hard for me to remember this, but I told them that I signed those documents. They grabbed me by my hand, but by both hands, and they pulled them all the way up, through my back. And I couldn't withstand the pain on both of my hands, but especially my left hand, where I had a surgery after I fractured it, saving my life, jumping out of that building on fire. And they knew it because they could see my scar, and they asked me what happened. And of course I shared what happened, just like, normally I would. And they took advantage of my hand because every time something would happen, they would go for my left hand immediately. And in one of those times, I felt like something cracked, and that's when they started to give me medicine, medicine that would make me incredibly drowsy and just sleepy. And I refused to take the medicine for weeks, but later on I couldn't stand the pain anymore, and I started accepting their medicine. um, Unfortunately, I sometimes I didn't knew what medicine they gave me. Sometimes it was just sleeping pills, and it wasn't pills for the pain, because I would wake up with my hands still swollen and with so much pain. But they would make me go to sleep with the pills that they would give me. Um, it was on 10th day that I signed my voluntary departure because of that torture, those abuses. And they told me the next day they're coming for you and you'll be deported tomorrow, the next day. And so I actually became happy, and I was happy for a moment. And the next day they came back and I said, I thought I was being deported today. They said, no, you're not being deported today. You're being deported in 3 days. And in 3 days they came back. I again asked. I thought I was being deported, and they said, "No, you're not being deported." And this today, you're being deported in another. And they would give me time after time after time. I would ask, and they would add more days and more days. And I think of this also as torture, as part of their known way of carrying out torturous activities that make you break completely as a person, and you lose yourself through what they're telling you. Imagine yourself being in a prison, and they tell you they're gonna come for you tomorrow and you're gonna be able to be free again, and you're never going to see us again or our faces. And then they tell you, you know what, we lied basically, and you're staying another week. And they went on for weeks and for weeks and for days and days and days. They would tell me I would be deported every 3 days, and it was a lie. We need to think about also the personal, the ICE personnel, not only about the ICE people who are out there, who are about 8,000 of them, pulling people out of their homes in the middle of the night, throwing down their doors without any type of warrant. We need to think about, those 8,000 people who are out there, leaving children in foster care, taking mothers and fathers, as they drop their children to school, dragging them from taking refuge inside of churches. We need to denounce them and think about them as what they really are, being fueled by white supremacy and misinformation and hate and xenophobia for all the other, right? But we also need to think about the doctors inside of the prisons handled by ICE. We need to think about the nurses. We need to think about the people who cook the food. And we need to think about the people who are there to be mental health supporters, who are there to be, even those who are there to preach the Bible. They are also part of this deportation machine. And we
Right.
need to stop considering them as someone who is just simply poor and who didn't have, a way of providing for their families. We need to start a campaign to let them know that they're
Mm.
also part of the ICE deportation machine, and that they are also part of the torture and the
Right.
suffering of thousands of people directly, because they also treat you as someone less than human. And many
Right.
times I experienced it with my case manager, my ICE case manager. She would tell me one thing, and then she would
Who was
tell
your ICE
another
case
thing to
manager?
my lawyer.
Who was your ICE case manager?
I don't remember her name, honestly.
We can follow up with you
I'm
later.
not
We're going to
sure.
follow up on a lot of this. So, quick, just a couple quick questions, bookkeeping questions. Do you remember the name of any of the medicines? Because we intend to file FOIA requests into this prison and find out more. So, do you remember the name of any of the medicines that they gave you?
They would never give me the names of the medicines. I would ask every time. Many times I would that's why I would start complaining and protesting, because I wanted to know what I was taking. And I never knew it because they would bring it already completely pulverized,
Right.
and they would give it to me in a little in a little in a little, what is it, in a little envelope. It
Okay.
was just like, 1.5 inches by 3 inches, and I had to throw it on my mouth, so that they would know I took it. I had to throw it on my mouth, and they would never tell me what it was. Never. I
Hmm.
protested many times, and that's one of the reasons why I was sent to the solitary confinement one of those times, because I refused to take the medicine because they wouldn't tell me what I was taking.
So, you mentioned that you were given a card to call outwardly, but the card had the wrong password, but that you did get through to your grandparents on one call. What did you say to them? Like, what was that conversation like?
Wow, it was one of the most just horrifying things I could have told my family. When I was in the United States, I never once gave them a call to tell them that I was struggling, because, I knew that I could always get ahead, and I could always get out of trouble on my own. I was always a hard worker and a good, smart kid. But that conversation with my grandparents was absolutely heartbreaking. It was it debilitated my soul so much, because my grandmother was the one to answer the call, and she was the only one there, and she was the only one that I could tell that I was in jail, and that I was being tortured, and that they were doing multiple things to me. And with her, I was a bit more open about what they were doing to me, and I told her in hopes that she would reach out and she could tell the my allies and lawyers that I was inside of the prison. And she was completely devastated. She's still healing up to this day from that call. She doesn't want to remember it. Um, she always, our grandmothers are our soul and heart. And my grandmother raised me, since I was a little kid, as a baby. She raised me with my grandpa, so she's also my mother. And so for her it was absolutely devastating. I tell her I'm in jail. They put me in prison. I've been here for the past 7 days, and they wouldn't allow me to give out a call. I've been here, and they've been doing this and this to me. I can't take it anymore. Please call this person, and tell them that I am in here. And she immediately, started obviously contacting different people, but she was absolutely devastated. I remember that, she tells me that that day she called for a mass here in my small town, and hundreds of people attended. Um, after when the mass was held, to pray for me and to pray for my liberation. It is no, I don't think it's, I'm not the guy who likes to talk about religion, but the saint, one of the saints here, the saint of my home state of Zacatecas in Mexico, it's the saint of the enslaved and of the incarcerated. So everyone obviously was absolutely devastated, and they started to make trips to see the cathedral of the saint, of the incarcerated and of the slaved. And it was obviously my community started mobilizing here and in the United States. But I now that I remember well, it was almost about 14 days before I actually could call my grandmother.
Wow. And so just to go back through real quick, just to review like just some bookkeeping items. You were detained in February of 2019 and
I was detained on October of 2018.
October of
Detained
2018.
2018, the 18th of October of 2018, and I was released on 2019 on the 1st of February. I flew down to Mexico. I was flown down. They took me, from the jail. I had been transferred to 5 different jails at that time.
Can you list those
Um,
5 jails for us real quick? Just so that, again, this is more for FOIA requests that we'll send next week.
Absolutely. If I could, I would. But the first one was obviously the detention center, the little out booking office in Ackworth, Georgia. So the Ackworth, Georgia detention center. The second one was the Cobb County Detention Center. The third one was Lovejoy, Georgia Detention Center, and I'm sure of three of them. I don't remember the other two.
We can follow up with you. It's
But the
just,
other one
it's just since we have you. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
was Irwin Detention Center. The other one, which was the worst
The
for
infamous.
me, along with Cobb County, they both treated me horrendously. So those are the two ones. And the other question was, what was the other question?
Well, so okay, so the dates of your detention we have now, the locations of your detention we have now. What else should we be requesting this week in terms of Freedom of Information Act? Like when we look into your case, are there, like, because I know that some of these companies are run like, what are the guards there? You mentioned that they don't have name tags, most of them.
Right.
Do they have other identifying material on them?
They take it off. Sometimes they wear a little bandage on their hand, on their arm, but they also take it off. They also take it off when they approach the prisoners. And so it was for me hard. I have a really good memory. I see something, I remember it, and I just have to look it up on what exactly I saw and what it read. But I can't remember because the name tags were never in existence. And honestly, part of the torture was that I never would know how their name was. And when I would ask them, they would use only nicknames. And so I remember some of the nicknames, but the
What
nicknames
are some of the nicknames?
are even demeaning. So it was demeaning to me to hear their nicknames, because it was like Officer Ballsy, or Officer Big Balls, or Officer, etc., things like that, that didn't make any sense, and that I obviously knew were in their names. So they did
But
and
so we have
do.
Ballsy and Big Balls. Are there any other names of dogs? Because I'm just thinking, if they're chatting about this, and we can FOIA it, and they're calling each other Ballsy and Big Balls and stuff like that, it just helps corroborate your story. Because honestly, we should build a case
Yeah,
against
sure.
these motherfuckers, fuck ice. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So
No, but honestly, these fuckers, they are not. They're just playing with you. It's to play with you. And one day they tell you one nickname, and the next day they tell you another nickname. And so that's how I was. I was like, that's not what you said yesterday, and that's not what you said the day before. And they didn't give a single flying, care about the prisoners knowing their name. So,
can I ask you a quick question? What you're
yeah.
telling us, is this a story that you've told before? Have you ever told this story? Like, has it been recorded before? Like, has anybody gone to you post deportation and said, we want to document your story in as much detail as possible to create the case against
So
ICE?
much work. So for me, who is documenting my story, it's so far I haven't spoken to many people, because I would reject most of the interviews. I would reject, I don't want to talk about it, because it was so hard for me that I would choke, I would start crying, and I wouldn't stop. Or I simply couldn't get myself to even, I was left speechless. So now you guys are probably the second people that I talk to, aside from my lawyers. I have my lawyers working on my case in the state of Georgia, and some of the people from Massachusetts are working on my case. So they are my lawyers have heard some of my story. They want me to wait a little bit more before because even as the days go on, I remember more and more specific details about how badly it was treated and others were treated. And they want us to go, obviously, through a specific process that is going to help me get back to the United States, if that is my wish. But at the
What
same
is that
time,
process?
I have rejected much of the interviews that have been offered to me before to speak about this. And what I really want is, now I want to speak. My voice is back. My family have been giving me
Good.
all the love, and my heart and my soul is been healing slowly but surely. And with what's happening with ICE right now, completely out of control, completely, an apparatus that is absolutely horrifying. And
Eduardo, so I think a really important question to ask at this point is, who is documenting your story sort of post deportation? Like, again, like we all, journalists especially, want to know what's going on inside of these detention centers. But it seems like so often when somebody is removed from the country, we never hear from them again. So on your end, has anybody reached out to you about documenting your, as a Chileno, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission after Pinochet. My uncles went through. My uncles were also, like you, torture victims, but they had to tell their story and get it documented down so that the courts and everybody could look at it. Is this happening for torture victims like you, for the torture victims of ICE?
So what is happening is that it is incredibly hard for people to share their stories, especially right away after experiencing such, tremendous traumatizing torture, right? That they're put through. For me, it's taken 2 years to be able to speak about this. It's been 2 years for me that of healing, of family, embracing, and of feeling their love and their support, and basically to raise me up once again from the bottom of the hole where I was left after I was deported. I was uprooted from the chosen home that I had built, from the friends and from the family I had created, through so much work.
Eduardo, so your case in the state of Georgia, can you give us kind of an update on what's going on there? Like, when can we expect to see you back in Washington raising good trouble?
Well, if it was because of me, I'll be there right there tomorrow with a megaphone on hand and with my good friends and family out there on the street. But the reality is much much more difficult, and I'm working with after I was deported immediately, I filed my appeal of deportation, and this appeal of deportation I filed it with my good friends and lawyers in the state of Massachusetts, human rights lawyers who have incredible um, trust by the community and by me. But unfortunately, my lawyers now in Georgia say that this appeal of deportation is basically moot, so it's not going to proceed because of a few different reasons that I can remember, to be specific and explain and give a truthful and full answer. But I no longer have an appeal of deportation, so a judge is not going to be able to bring me from Mexico to the United States, so I can again go basically on an audience and tell them how tortured and how badly tortured I was, and why I like to continue to stay in the United States and get my proper documentation. But now my people in Massachusetts, in Georgia, they realize that process went completely wrong, and so unfortunately, there's no way for me to come back to the United States. So they're finding their way, and it's incredibly important for them. These are serious people, as is incredibly important for me. But we're waiting to see what would be the best option for me on how to apply, and maybe perhaps directly pleading to the Biden administration, right, through the Dream and Act and Dream and Promise Act, that would allow people like me to come to the United States. If there is no other way, that would be the only way, by getting rid of the filibuster and passing the Dream and Promise Act of 2011, that would allow people like me deported under the Trump administration to come back to the United States. So that's where my case is right now, Pablo.
Eduardo Samaniego, thank you so much for joining Meet La Prensa with your story. We want to know more. We're going to check up on you a lot. So please bear with us if we're always in your inbox asking you to come back on air to talk. Thank you so much for joining and sharing your story with us. Audience, if you find value here, and I know you do, like and subscribe. We'll share Eduardo's Twitter handle right here in the bio. And thank you so much for joining another episode of Meet La Prensa. That's a wrap.